The one person who would understand Scottish Gaelic is Lachlan, of course, Lachlan, who is buried on the island of Mull, just off the coast of Scotland. I went to welcome you all to his house, which will make a very nice embassy for the new Republic of Scotland when we hope for independence in September. I want to thank Roger and his team for asking me to speak today about solidarity between Australian and international communities, and I really do feel honoured to do so. But it's a bit beyond me quite why he asked a slightly faded Scotsman who's never been a volunteer and who's not an Australian citizen, but I'm prepared to talk about anything for a free lunch, so thank you. Before being asked to join the board of directors of PALMS, I'd heard the work of the agency from various friends in the development field, and they all voiced great admiration for its approach, which is, of course, it puts the emphasis on human relationships to diminish the gap between the rich and the poor, the so-called developing and the so-called developed countries, and those on the so-called periphery and those in the so-called centre, all terms which betray a world system gone wrong. I got to know the agency better by using the services to find a volunteer tutor for our Burmese refugee students in Mysort on the Thai-Burma border. In fact, we're now on our second one, Rosalind Smythe. And also we asked PALMS to prepare to teach the preparation unit for the immersion experience, which our students studying for the Bachelor of International Development Studies degree have to undertake. And in fact, one of the options for placement is to go with PALMS to Timor-Leste. I'm utterly convinced that its methods aren't just developmentally sound, but vital in bringing volunteerism into the realm of relationships between people, bridging all kinds of gaps between human communities and establishing a network of solidarity through its intercultural work that will contribute to a real transformation of people and ultimately, hopefully, government policies and issues of aid and development. I know PALMS is seeking a new path, especially in the light of the decision by AusAid to pool funding, not because of the cost of PALMS's programs or the lack of efficacy, but because AusAid didn't have enough staff in Canberra to monitor the smaller agencies. God knows how many staff they have now, but anyway. It was really a very bureaucratic decision, and I think very much a wrong one. For me, the new path is clear for PALMS, and that is for PALMS to be more integrated into the Catholic Church system than you would expect, having spent 12 years in the Vatican, you would expect me to say that. I realise it's slightly controversial. After all, isn't the Catholic Church the church that likes to say no? Doesn't it mean cardinals flouncing about in old lace and long trains? Doesn't it mean the ousting of voices of dissent and the perpetration of child abuse by those in a position of trust and the hiding of these crimes by church authorities? Well, yes, all of that is true. And particularly the last one about child abuse, but hopefully that will be more honestly addressed in the future. But I think that this is an exciting era to be a Catholic, because the time of the poor and social Catholic teaching as the centerpiece has arrived with the election of Pope Francis, his appointment of Archbishop Pietro Parolin as the Secretary of State for the Vatican, and with Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez, President of Caritas Internationalis, as head of the group of cardinals who's going to do a very difficult job of trying to reform the Curia. Personally, I would get rid of it and start again, but at least we're to try and reform it. And Cardinal Oscar, by the way, will be awarded an honorary doctorate by ECU a week on Monday. So why is Catholic social teaching, with my assistant, please get this, so important? Well, first of all, it gives us a moral framework for viewing society, which resonates not just with Catholics or Christians, but people of all faiths and none, because we're basically talking about a system of basic human values. It's not immutable teaching. The social teaching documents of the bishops and the popes are called situational documents because they must be contextualized to be implemented. They're not doctrine in the strictest sense, but as the Vatican's Compendium on Social Teaching states, they are principles for reflection, criteria for judgment, and directives for action which are the starting point for the promotion of an integral humanism with solidarity at its core. So we see through the lens of these principles, not as neutral bystanders, because we experience ethical indignation, as the theologians call it. Ethical indignation at a very clear injustice. And that ethical indignation evokes in us a desire to change the situation. We judge in the light of these principles, and after reflection, we act to change the injustice. But our starting point is always the innate dignity of the human person. Not just a Christian concept, but one that's embedded in the very secular Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that means not treating people as commodities or economic pawns, or reifying them, making them things, acting as if they didn't exist. I remember once being in a bus in Tamil Nadu in India. I was going from a village back to Madras, or Chennai as it's called now. And there was this high caste Brahmin with a billowing robe, leaning out of the window talking to someone. The only problem was that next to that window was a poor man. He was obviously a Dalit, the so-called untouchable. But for the Brahmin, and the Brahmin's cloak was right in the man's face like this. But for the cosmos of this Brahmin, the man didn't exist. He was a Dalit, and therefore he was not fully human. And that is the kind of circumstance that we see in many situations today. Because it's also true, to take a topical example here in Australia, of the humanity of asylum seekers coming by boat legally, not illegally, but legally to Australia. The principle of the common good says that we really are responsible for one another as a human family. That as radically social creatures, we must create community, and a community that excludes no one. And I'm very proud to say, as a member of staff of ACU, that an example of this principle in action is ACU's programme to offer tertiary education to Burmese refugees from camps along the Thai side of the Thai border. Some of these refugees were born in the camps, like the young man we're going to see now, like Albert here, who's 22 years of age, did all his education in a refugee camp, and yet he's as bright as a button, doing extremely well, and will graduate in the Diploma in Liberal Studies at the end of November. After being accepted into our programme, most of these students have flourished. We'll be graduating, at the end of next month, we'll be graduating another 37 or 38, 48 altogether. And that will mean we have graduated, since the programme began in 2004, 122 young Burmese. Some have gone on to degree studies in Thai or European, Australian or American universities, while others have worked in community-based organisations such as the Karen Human Rights Group, which monitors human rights abuses within Burma, a very dangerous occupation. We're very proud of one graduate called Albert Mu, and we can't show his photo for reasons I'll tell you about. He's the field director of KHRG, of the Karen Human Rights Group. And last year, he was addressing the Human Rights Council of the UN in New York on ongoing human rights abuses in Burma. Not bad for a guy who just 5 years before was a refugee in Mela camp. We have one student at the moment, this guy here, Eugene, who speaks with a slight English accent. And I asked him how on earth he made the mistake of speaking like that. And he said, well, when in Mela refugee camp, I learned English listening to Stephen Fry's audiobooks of Harry Potter. And so that's why I speak like this. He's also a self-taught violinist. And this is when Kate over here and myself were with Tristan Velasco, a wonderful photographer too. But he played as Vivaldi and Mozart. He's a self-taught violinist. He played Vivaldi and Mozart extremely well. He is an amazing young man, as all of these young people are. And yet, ACU is only really doing exactly what the teaching says and what Pope John Paul II said a Catholic university should do. Provide tertiary education not just for those who can pay for it, but for those who normally wouldn't have access to it. And it's doing it in an endogenous way. It's coming from within that Catholic identity as a university open to all. The preferential option for the poor means making the poorest a priority, whether it's in budgetary decisions or in our PALMS work. By the poorest, what Caritas Australia calls the poorest of the poor, I mean those whose very humanity has been reduced so much that they can't function in society and can't flourish fully as human beings. Yesterday I just came back from Cambodia, where I was looking at programs of Caritas Australia through what I like to call the dignity lens, using Catholic social teaching principles as indicators of good integral human development practice. The Cambodian staff of the Caritas office in Phnom Penh support various community-based organisations which reach the poorest and move right into paddy fields away out in the countryside there. And these people from the CBOs were trained in what they simply called CST. I don't think they know what the C is, but it doesn't really matter. Training in principles and linking them to the development of the human person. And what I discovered was really remarkable, because what they've done is that the partners themselves have changed their attitude utterly to who the poor are. They missed the real poor before because they didn't go far enough into the countryside. They weren't prepared to see the poorest deep in the rural areas. They weren't prepared to get in touch with those who were disabled and hidden from view. And they weren't prepared to find people who were HIV positive and who were shunned by the other villagers or who simply had hid their status. They not only sought out the widows and orphans, the disabled and the destitute, or those who were HIV positive, and built programs around them, but the programs were so focused on them, and this is a self-help group here, that they sent ripples to the wider community. And that wider community of the middle poor and the rich means you've got a motorbike in rural Cambodia, they then accepted these people that they had shunned sometimes for generations, accepted them into the community. So whenever there was a communal meeting about a road or about irrigation, they would be part and parcel of that meeting. They've been trained on what the Khmer even call in their own language, gender. And that has meant a decline in domestic violence and drinking. Children of illiterate parents, some of whom are quite young, now go to school. And there's been an increase in hygiene and a decrease in disease. They have clean water, clean houses, and yards and small shops. Quite remarkable, because very often you find shops being very much higgledy-piggledy, but these were absolutely pristine and tidy, and shows the kind of pride that has been developed in them through this system. They earn money through, it's not rocket science, but through growing vegetables and selling them in the market. Whereas before there was just stasis, there was no movement in their life. Many of them said to me, my life was miserable, it was my karma, my fate, and now I feel as if I'm actually living. The programme is a fantastic example of what putting the dignity of the human person at the centre of development can do. Increasing people's sense of self-worth, ridding the community of barriers, increasing the participation of all the people in their society, and making them subjects of their own development, and not the object of someone else's idea of how they should be developed. A 15-year-old girl who was HIV and HIV positive orphan told me of a dream of becoming a nurse or even a doctor. Now, healthy, cared for and educated, she actually may realize that dream. This is development as transformation. Not the transformation of becoming Christians with some NGOs, but the transformation of becoming more fully human, of realizing, in a Amartya Sen's phrase, the capabilities that you have within yourself, and not getting anywhere because of a lack of confidence, a lack of education, and a lack of feeling that you don't belong to a community, you don't belong to society. Development is a process of expanding the real freedoms that people enjoy. John Sobrino is a Basque Jesuit who escaped the assassin's bullet in El Salvador during the proxy wars there. Once said that if our lives profoundly touch the lives of the poor, and if we're open, we become transformed because we rediscover what being human means. This is the way forward for PALMS in terms of its volunteers and their task when they come home, bringing what they've learned about the transformation of the life of the poorest in their placements, and through their own transformation, influencing the Australian public and hopefully somewhere down the line, policy. And this is what solidarity, so often a cliche, calls us to. It's the state, in the South African, Dominican Albert Nolan's words, where there is neither a you nor a me, only an us. And that could be a motto for the PALMS way, becoming more fully part of that wider Catholic family centred on the poor and exercising solidarity overseas and at home. I wish the PALMS volunteers and staff well in the future, and I hope that the new path, whatever it is, will strengthen you, enable your take on solidarity to counteract a lifestyle that is neither sustainable nor generous, and show Australians another way, learn from the poor, honed by a dignity-based approach, and transformative in the deepest sense possible. The late great Irish poet Seamus Heaney wrote in his famous words, "History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme." My wish for PALMS, my wish for PALMS is that this is the time when the tidal wave of justice can rise up for you. And the hope you bring to the poor overseas and the perplexed in Australia can rhyme with the new history of a church that puts at last the poor first, the poor at the centre, and a world that judges you less on your material wealth or how many iPhones you have, but more on what you do for others. Thank you.
Here, here.